In this video, we're going to continue our mesh baking series in InstaMAT by walking through how to create a reusable automatic mesh baking workflow with InstaMAT's element graph. In the previous video, we looked at how to use the mesh baking panel to bake and transfer details from a high poly source mesh onto a low poly target mesh so that we can quickly texture our 3D models with layers using InstaMAT's asset texturing project type. In this video, we're going to switch over to InstaMAT's node-based workflow using the element graph, which allows us to create powerful procedural workflows to create and process images, meshes, and much more. By the end of this video, you'll be able to create a workflow that uses the Mesh Bake node to automatically bake mesh maps for any input geometry. You'll then be able to export these baked mesh maps as images or continue to build and extend this graph using InstaMAT's many powerful nodes and features. We've got a lot of fun things to cover, so let's get started. All right, so here we are where we left off in the previous video, where we gone ahead and we baked mesh maps for this asset texturing project. But now what I want to do is I want to switch gears and go into the node-based workflow in InstaMAT. So I'm going to go and create a new project here, and I'm going to choose Element Graph, and I'm going to create a project without a template. So now you can see that I have a few extra things in the package here. You can see I've got my high and low poly versions here. I've gone ahead and imported the Lion into the package so I can readily use all my assets and keep everything together. Packages are a great way to be able to share files and transfer, large projects that have multiple dependencies and resources and keep everything together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how we can use InstaMAT's bakers and use them in a node-based workflow where we can create these reusable, powerful pipelines using the element graph. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to right click to bring up quick search and I'm going to type in mesh bake. So this is the mesh bake node and this is the star of the show. This puts all of InstaMAT's CPU and GPU powered bakers into one node here that we can use in our projects. It's super, super powerful. And you can see that it has a source mesh and a target mesh input here. And so what are we going to do? Well, we're just going to supply the high poly source mesh and the low poly target mesh as inputs. So to do that in the element graph, it's really easy to bring in meshes. I can take my Lion, my high poly, and I can go ahead and just drag it from the package management panel into the graph. And I'm going to spawn it as an element mesh. And there we go. You can see if I click on this pin, I have my high poly Lion, there it is. And, I can go ahead and just connect it as the source mesh. And you can see it's already going to start baking and doing some fun things. But we also need to supply a target mesh. So now let's go ahead and bring in the low poly in the same way. I'm just going to drag and drop it in. Again, clicking on that pin, we can now see that's the low poly version of it with the UVs already. And I can just connect the pin to the target mesh. And there we go. Very quickly, you can see just how fast that was. We've now baked our tangent-based normal map. It's a super fast, really nice workflow in InstaMAT. By the way, I did mention previously maybe in the previous video, the low poly has its UVs unwrapped, right? So I can do something like type in mesh UV, bring up the mesh UV node. You can see we have those UVs created for us, but we could also unwrap the UVs of our low poly mesh inside of InstaMAT using something like the mesh UV unwrap node. And it's a really, really powerful way of working. You can just bring in your high poly. You can even optimize, decimate it down, and unwrap UVs to create the whole high to low poly workflow right here within the element graph. But we're getting a little bit out of scope of this video, so I'm just going to go ahead and continue on talking about the mesh bake and baking using the element graph. So there you go. You can see that's how easy it was to bake those mesh maps. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enable a few more of the bakers just by turning on these switches here. So let's do the normal world space. Let's do the ambient occlusion. And you can see very quickly those are firing off and baking really fast here. I'm just clicking on the output pins here, or I can also press V on my keyboard to view all the different outputs here. It's just going to cycle through them. Let's also do the thickness and position and curvature maps. And very quickly, you can now see we have all of the mesh maps that we could possibly want to texture our asset or continue creating this mesh baking workflow. So now let's say, for example, I'd like to view my normal map, my tangent space normal map on the surface of my low poly map that I have here. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to make sure that I'm viewing the low poly mesh just by clicking the output pin there, or I can right click and choose view mesh. And then I'm going to right click the bake node and I'm going to say preview as material channel the mesh normal tangent output. So you can see this is the mesh normal tangent output. Again, preview as material channel, mesh normal tangent. What do I want to preview it as in the viewport? What kind of connection do I want to make to the viewport to view this? Well, I want to view that map as my normal tangent space map. And there you go. You can now see that I'm viewing the tangent space normal map that we just baked using the mesh bake node right here. And this is live. So if I go ahead and rebake this or change any of the inputs, we're going to see that automatically hooked up to the viewport. And this is really nice. So that's looking pretty good, but let's take this just a little bit further. In the last video, what we did was we took a smart prefab layer material that I was working on, and we started, texturing something right away. How do we do that here in the element graph? Well, we can do the exact same thing. I'm going to go over here to the mat library panel, and you can see I still have that smart prefab layer material that I was working on earlier. And so what I can do is I can just go ahead and drag that right into the graph as well. And you can see that we have a node here that represents all the layers and effects and stuff that I have in my prefab material. And we can drive this node with our baked mesh maps, which you can see here, and our target mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the low poly mesh here as the mesh input. That's our target mesh, and that's where we've baked all the details onto. That's also our working mesh, like we're working on a layering project. You can see it started to work away, and that's great. But now what I want to do is I want to connect all of these baked mesh map pins to our layering project that we have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter what's known as link category mode. And what that does is it combines all of these related pins together. You can see it now says mesh bake data instead of before where I had to individually connect all these pins. So I'm just going to connect the mesh bake data to the mesh bake data input here. And there we go. We've now supplied all the baking information to our project here, to the smart prefab material. And by the way, I did drag a smart prefab material here, but what we could also do is I can go into my package and you can see that I have that lion statue project that I was working on. That's this one here, where maybe I've continued to build on top of this. I've done some painting and some extra work. What I could also do is I could just drag that layering project into the graph as well. And if I go ahead and just drop this here, you can see there it is, my lion statue project. And I can build on top of this, which is really neat. So I'm just gonna go ahead and use the prefab material that I worked with, but it's a nice handy way of working where you can connect multiple projects, layer-based and node-based together into a really powerful workflow here in InstaMAT. So what do we do now? We've connected our mesh bake node to our project here. And so I want to go ahead and view my low poly model here in, let's go ahead and click on the pin in the viewport. And then all I have to do is right click my project and say preview as 3D material. And it's going to take all of these outputs, these related outputs to all the PBR information, base color roughness, you name it. And it's going to hook it up into the viewport. And now I can view my project and my completed asset here, and it's good to go. So what did we do here? We started off with our mesh bake node, and we brought in our high poly and our low poly meshes here into the graph, and we connected them to the source and target mesh inputs of the mesh bake node. We then enabled all the bakers that we need, like the tangent space normal map, ambient occlusion, things like that. And then what we did was we brought in our texturing project. Now we could go ahead and use nodes like, the blend node here, or something like a levels. And we could continue texturing and creating materials in this graph as well. But in this case, I used a project that I already started working on and just brought it right into the element graph. It's such an essential and powerful workflow here in InstaMAT. So once we've hooked up all of our baked mesh maps here to this project that we've added in, we can now start to continue working on it or texture this asset. So now that I've brought this in, how do I get these textures and these baked mesh maps out of InstaMat or pass it on to the next part of my project? Well, there's a few ways that we can do this. One way is, I can go ahead and click, the base color output here, or better yet, let's go ahead and talk about how we can export our baked mesh maps, right? I can go ahead and find my tangent space normal map here and click that to view it in the image viewer, and I can just go ahead and press this floppy disk icon, and that's gonna, bring up a dialog, and I can just go ahead and save my baked mesh map out as a file. The same thing can be done for really any parameter here. So if I go ahead and view, let's go ahead and say, like the roughness of my textures, after I'm done texturing it. I just want to export a roughness map of it once everything's applied to the model. I can just go ahead and choose to export that here. But maybe I want to export a whole bunch of these maps out at once, or I want to pass this data along another way. What we can do is we can also create outputs. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag a connection off of this base color and choose to expose base color as graph output, right? There we go. So maybe I want the base color of this, and maybe I also want something like the ambient occlusion map that we're generating from the bake. And I'll go ahead and say, let's just find the mesh ambient occlusion map here and expose that as an output as well. And so we can do this for any of the maps that we want to export. And then what I could do is I can go over to this curved arrow here, and this is going to bring up the image and data export dialog. And you'll notice now I have it's detected I have those two outputs in my graph, and I can just start exporting my files out. And what's really nice is I can use some of the templates. Like for example, we have this one template for Polyverse, which automatically lets you export meshes, export textures and texturing projects so that they're very easily brought into abstract Polyverse. Or I can do the same thing for something like, RSX engine, where it automatically packs all of the ambient occlusion, roughness, and metalness information into the right format for RSX engine. So you can use this template system. You can create your own as well. Just like in the mesh baking window, you can set up some naming conventions and the file formats and stuff like that, and just click export, and it will go ahead and export all of the outputs that you have enabled here in this panel. So that's a great way to be able to export images and meshes also all together using that one panel. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove these outputs here. And there's one last thing that I want to show you before we finish up this video, which is, it's really great that we can use this node-based workflow to bake mesh maps and texture our assets. But here's where things start to get even more powerful. All of this is done procedurally, right? And so what we can do is we can reuse this workflow, this texturing and baking workflow that we have here on multiple meshes and assets. And that's where, InstaMAT's power really starts to shine. So let me show you an example of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enable or click this lock here. And what this lock does is it prevents InstaMAT from rendering the graph when I make a change. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch out both of these inputs, and I just don't want the mesh bake node to, fire off and start baking and texturing when I've only, changed this one input. So what we can see here is in my package, I have another statue, high and low poly versions of this statue here, as you can see here. And I'm just going to replace these inputs with these new meshes. So I'm going to double click the input here for my high poly, and I'm going to choose the high poly statue. And there we go. You can see it's going to flash at me and saying, okay, I'm preventing a change. I'm preventing a re-render of this graph because I just want to go ahead and do this for the source mesh for the target mesh as well. So let's go ahead and bring in the low poly. So we have our high poly and our low poly already hooked up here as these inputs, and I'm just going to go ahead and open that lock there, and it's now going to bake those mesh maps and texture the asset. So to see that in action, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on the output of this pin here, and we can now see we have our textured and baked statue. And if I click the little 3D cube here, so I make the viewport the center stage, you can see that we've now baked and textured this asset. This is the low poly version of this statue. And you can see we've got things like the moss projected onto the surface, and we've got the dirt kind of rising up from the bottom here. It's really, really cool. And I didn't have to do any extra work here because we can see that all I had to do was just replace the inputs. Then the mesh bake node fired off and did all the baking. And then we've applied our smart prefab layer material here as well. And so I can continue to reuse this workflow and texture my assets this way. So thanks for watching this video on using the mesh bake node to create reusable mesh baking workflows using InstaMAT's element graph. Now, if you're curious about how to texture 3D models with InstaMAT's layer and node-based workflows, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, and I'll go ahead and provide some links of those texturing videos and workflows in the description as well. If you enjoyed this video, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. For the latest news about InstaMAT, please visit our website, follow us on X, join us on Discord, or sign up for the Abstract community. You can find all the links in the video description below. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.